And like he was notoriously corrupt, but it's, to the best of my knowledge, there's never been a full, real deep look into it.
Whim.
And I think that would be fun because that was organized crime in its own way as well. Because he was corrupt, apparently, and I don't know. I think some of this might be exaggerated, but apparently this is where like there were Irish mobs, and I don't know that Milwaukee really ever had Irish mobs, but if they did, that would be the time that they did.
And I'm sure that they probably did. It just might not have been significant enough. Because, I mean, there were Irish in Milwaukee, right?
Yeah.
So there was probably some sort of mob there. It just was probably not significant enough to really have caught into news and stuff like that. So.
I'd love to see it. And I personally don't have any intentions of doing it. So just... If I always got to say that when I'm like, I'd love to see this. Not going to do it. And sometimes I've said that and then I end up doing it. But pretty sure I'm not doing this one. Because I don't feel that's a time period I have a strength in. I think somebody could do a much, much better job. So there's that. Totally unrelated. Switching gears. One thing I've really enjoyed about the podcast is... there's the big stories, right? The murders. And I think that's what generally would get you the audience. You know, you're like, murder, murder, murder. And then people are like, ooh, I want to hear the murder story. And I don't know how that translates to numbers. Maybe those episodes have better numbers. I don't know. But I can say, from the email side of things, I get way more emails when we talk about a topic or a person who is very insignificant.
Really?
You know,
that's interesting.
Yeah.
And it's probably just because there's no content at all out there about that person.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And that, you know, it's not going to grab headlines. It's not going to be like, oh, that's the exciting story. But I'll more often get an email being like, oh, I knew that person, or, oh, that was a relative of mine. You know, when we do the big murder story, I don't have somebody suddenly being like, oh, yeah, that was my relative that was murdered, you know, because they've heard it, you know, like they've heard that story. So it's kind of interesting that, like, I would have thought, oh, the really minor stories that I enjoy, I thought, like, well, maybe they're not going to play as well. And they might not from the download standpoint. But they seem to connect with people better. And I think there's a lot of good that can be said of that. So I'm really happy when that happens. I always get nervous when I check my email and I get an email. I get nervous. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be cranky with me. But generally, then people are very nice. And that's always really cool when someone reaches out and they're like, oh, yeah, da-da-da-da-da. Like I've recently gotten emails about Dominic Frinzi. I got emails about Mackey Brothers, got email about, I don't remember who else, another person, but like people coming in and they got these stories, you know. And Dominic Frinzi, like, although I think he was a big name, nobody really knows who he is.
Yeah, like today.
Yeah, today. So
he had a big name within that world, but considering that there's not much left out there about that world. Yeah. You're just not going to hear about him.
Yeah, he was a big deal in his own way, especially like within Milwaukee. But yeah, he's not like really remembered. So people seem to have liked that he's been covered. So
I have kind of I think this question's going to go might be a little off topic of the episode, but I think it's probably the best time other than a Patreon to ask the question. So
this is the time.
So me and my wife do a book review podcast.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we review all the books we read.
Yeah.
And I recently finished reading Shallow Grave.
You did?
Yes. So we had this conversation about this book because one of the things I've always noticed about, and you've actually said this before too, that with the way you do things is that you take the murder and then you pack the history around it.
Yes.
And Shallow Grave is like, huge. That book is huge into that because you go so deep into every character that's in that story.
Yeah.
You know, you tell the full story. So my question is, you also do that on the podcast. So I'm wondering, why do you do that? And first of all, because I don't read a lot of true crime type stuff. So is that a common way to tell the true crime story?
No.
Because, okay, that is not a common way. Okay, that's great. So then my other thought was that, is it just that because you're doing such a niche topic like Milwaukee, that there's so little content that to write a whole book about the Frank Biernet murder would not be possible without telling the backstories of all the characters? Or is there another reason why you approach it in that way?
I don't know if that it wouldn't be possible. A couple of different things I want to respond here. I'm easily distracted. And I don't, I mean, not like day-to-day life, I'm not easy, like a bird doesn't make me, but when I'm researching, I'm easily distracted. The book, again, that I just turned in is about a burglary in Reno. But there's a huge chunk of that book that talks about the rise of gambling syndicates in Detroit. Nothing to do with the burglary, remotely, except for the fact that the guys who ran the gambling syndicates in Detroit ended up running the casinos in Reno. And I thought, first of all, it distracted me. But second of all, I thought after it distracted me, it was interesting. And I thought it would paint a picture of Reno, being like, people probably don't know Reno as well as they know Vegas. So let's give them a whole background of how Reno came to be Reno and who are the players involved. Because the casino, although the burglary does not happen at the casinos are always in the background in the story. So I thought, this is relevant. But that's kind of like, originally when I put the outline together, that was not a chapter in the outline.
At all.
At all. But it's like, as the research goes on, that came up.
So, and that makes sense because I can remember you coming in and on numerous occasions when we're recording a podcast, you come in and say, well, this story kind of started here, but that's not where it ended up. And I assume that's the same thing is that you discover something along the way and you're like, well, this is really interesting. This has to be in it. And stuff like that. So that's cool. I mean, that was like, that was my primary thing about the review is just that style of writing I thought was fascinating and I thought it was cool.
Thanks.
How, and like, I'm curious to see once I get through all your books, just to see how, because I think you're going to do an amazing job of painting a whole world. Like, I think on the podcast, we talked about how, like, you're kind of creating the Marvel universe of Milwaukee Mafia.
I don't remember that comment, but I'll take it.
Well, no, this is in the book review that
okay.
podcast that me and Tracy did that I said.
Okay.
So, but yeah, I just thought that was really fascinating. So, kind of off topic, but it just popped into my head.
That's fine. And yeah, it's definitely a thing. As far as like how granted, like I don't read a whole lot of true crime. But I've read a lot of mafia books. Actually, in fact, I used to read a lot of true crime, so I guess I'm familiar. They're not typically like that. They're usually very focused on the criminal, and they tend to be a little exaggerated's not the word. Sensationalized, I guess.
Yeah, like just kind of
because they
tweak a couple things just to make it a lot more interesting.
They're like, oh, let's make this person seem a little crazier than they are, or a little bloodier than it was, and I get that, and that obviously has its appeal, and it works. That's not my style. Just last night, as we record this, so when people hear this, it'll be like 3 weeks ago or something. But last night, it came up in conversation. We were talking about the book The Devil in the White City.
Okay.
And I don't do this intentionally, but Eric Larson, the author, and I think have similar motivations in how we do things. Because The Devil in the White City, you want to buy the book because you're like, oh, it's about a serial killer who's in 1890s Chicago.
Mhm.
You know, you're like, ooh, you know.